When you first get started on conducting your own research, one of the most important things that you're going to need to do is a literature review. Now, the term literature, that refers to the mass of published information worldwide. And it's your job to start with a general idea and then search for existing literature on that research idea to gather your background information. And in doing this, it will help you to find a more specific research question that will allow you to then get started with your own study. So that's the whole point. The whole point of a literature review is to do your homework, learn what's been done, and then come up with a new idea to continue that line of research. Your study should just be a continuation of what's come before. That's how science works. Now, you want to make sure that the stuff you're reading, the stuff that's come before, is good stuff. And one thing that a lot of students tend to get confused about is what kind of sources should they be looking for. So there's two kinds. You have what are called primary sources, which are these first-hand reports in which the author describes their own observations. So these would be like peer-reviewed research articles and theses and dissertations and things like that. And then there are secondary sources, which are these second-hand reports in which authors discuss somebody else's observations. So whenever we talk about research in this class or in any class, the textbook for your class, no matter what class it might be, that is a compilation of other researchers' research. In other words, your textbook is a secondary source. The news, that's a secondary source. Wikipedia is a secondary source. You know, these things that tend to condense what's come before are almost always secondary. But if you look at the references list, if you look at the cited sources for that secondary source, that's how you can find the primaries. So you want to find those primaries. A secondary source is a great way to get started if you don't know where to look, but you want to find those primaries and actually read them to understand exactly what those researchers were doing and what they discovered. And when you find a research article, you're going to notice that it's broken down into a few basic components. The first part is what we call the introduction, where the author is going to present a logical development, and typically they've done their own literature review, which they will summarize here to provide the relevant background. The next part is the method, so that's where they describe how they conducted their own study. Third part is the results, so that's where they present the data in a summarized fashion and include statistical analyses. And then the fourth and final part is the discussion. So this is where the author, oftentimes in simple language, will interpret those results, describe the implications, and discuss the possible applications of this study's results. So it's in that discussion section where you're generally going to get the most interesting information. But you should really start with the introduction. Whenever you read a research article, start with the introduction so that you can at least get a general idea of what this research is all about. So that's that first major section of a research report. And the reason you want to look at it before anything else is so you can understand why they did this. You know, the researcher is going to present a logical development of the research that's come before and how they plan to continue it. This is also often where they will describe their own research ideas and maybe even state their hypothesis. So an introduction section, it's typically not much more than just a literature review. Then after that, you'll see the method section. So that's the section of the research report where they describe how the study was conducted, including information about who their participants were, and any procedures or materials that they had to develop. You want to make sure that if you did use any kind of study materials, like a survey, for example, that you describe those materials in this section. So when you're reading other people's research, you can see exactly what they did and how you could replicate it, how you could use the same materials. And then after that is the results section. So as I mentioned, this is where they present their data. Oftentimes you'll see a lot of statistical analyses like averages and standard deviations and correlations and things like that. And the whole point is to just try to summarize the most important findings of their study. But something that a lot of people tend to get confused about when it comes to results is that you're not supposed to explain the data. You're not supposed to try to offer some interpretation for why the data turned out this way. All you're doing is simply presenting the data. So you're just saying, you know, these participants got this score, these participants got that score, and so on. The interpretation of the data, that comes in the discussion section. So this is the portion of a research report that oftentimes starts with a restatement of the hypothesis, and then a summarization of the results, and then a discussion of how those results apply to the hypothesis. Like, did you support your hypothesis, or does your data not support your hypothesis? And then after that, it's pretty optional what the researcher wants to write about, but oftentimes they'll talk about what we could do in the future. Like, how might we be able to apply these results, or how might we continue this line of research? And most research studies do have multiple authors, and you do often get that kind of feeling like this is a discussion. It's a discussion between multiple individuals, yourself included. So that's what a research paper tends to look like. That's the basic structure of a research paper. You should always start with the introduction, and if the paper sounds interesting, I would recommend just skipping straight to the discussion so you can see what the big ideas were. And if you still want to learn more, then you can go back and look at the method and results. Because you don't want to be wasting a lot of time when you're doing a literature search. You don't want to be reading every, pointless method for studies that you don't really even care about. You want to make sure this is a good study before you get heavily invested in it, because the purpose of a literature search is to accomplish a couple of goals. First of all, you want to gain some general familiarity with the current research that's been done on this subject. And you also want to find a few studies that are highly related to your particular topic. So you don't have time to be reading everything that exists. You want to just find a few good things and prove that you've done your homework and that you understand what kind of research has come before. So you're just going to be looking for a relatively small set of research reports that define the current state of that field of research. And hopefully by collecting these few sources, you'll be able to identify some gap in the knowledge that we have on that subject. So when you do look at the introduction, you'll generally see something that looks a bit like this. So this is a typical opening paragraph for a research report. And when you write your own research, it should also look something like this. So the first part right here, this is where the author is selling the topic. They're trying to explain why you should care. Why should you read this paper? What's interesting about this topic? Think of yourself as a salesman when you write this first few sentences, these first few lines. You need to catch the reader's attention, right? You need to get them invested. And if you can catch their attention, then you move to the next part where you explain the general background. Like, what do we already know about the topic? What's the big idea here? What have we done before? And then the last part of this opening paragraph, that's where you can then say what you plan to do next. So the opening paragraph of your introduction, that's basically like a shortened version of your full paper, if you think about it. You're explaining why it's important, you're saying what's been done before, and now you're saying what you're going to do next. It's like a abstract almost. Now, there's a lot of stuff out there, as I mentioned, and it can take quite a long time to do a literature review. So what I recommend is, before you even get started, you need to do some preparation. You want to narrow down your general research idea into something more specific. Like, for example, if you're interested in mood disorders, that's great. That's a great subject. A lot of research has been done on that, but that's also really broad. Like, what is it about mood disorders that you're interested in? Are you interested in, you know, cyclothymia? Are you interested in bipolar? Are you interested in depression? And if you are interested in depression, what about depression? Are you interested in the causes of depression, or how depression affects people of different demographics? Like, you just need to try to narrow down. You need to try to pick a very specific idea. Otherwise, you're just going to be lost in the volumes and volumes of studies that have already been published on, something as broad as depression. So what I recommend, a good starting point is to, if you have a broad research idea, is to look at secondary sources. Go to Wikipedia, look in your textbook, and see what other people have done. See what other studies have been cited, and then maybe you could follow up on those primary sources. You can use the internet to find those primary sources and read more. So that can give you a good springboard into the research, so to say. And when you're looking at those, studies that you found in your secondary sources, you want to take note of a few things. Subject words, like, it's important that you use the correct terminology when you're looking for the previous research. Like, a lot of people talk about depression, but just for example, but it would probably be better if you use terms like major depression, or maybe you're interested in the term chronic depression. So just pay attention to the key terms that these researchers use. Another thing you should definitely pay attention to are author names. It's quite common in various fields of research that certain authors publish a lot on the subject, and they're fairly well known. So if you see the same author's name popping up again and again and again and again, that's probably somebody that you should pay attention to. Maybe you should download some of their research and read what they've done. So using key terms and using author names to find studies, well, you could do that in a number of different ways. But there are a lot of options to consider. There's a lot of online databases that you could take advantage of. And the typical one does contain millions of publications, which are cross-referenced by subject word, like these key terms I mentioned, and the author names, of course. And you can use those kinds of things to narrow down your searching. And as I mentioned, there's a lot of them. Like, there's PsycInfo, for example. PsycInfo is the American Psychological Association's definitive resource for abstracts of scholarly journal articles, book chapters, books, and dissertations. It's in fact the largest resource devoted to peer-reviewed literature in behavioral science and mental health. Then there's PsycArticles. So this is like a subsection of PsycInfo. It's the American Psychological Association's definitive source of full text, peer-reviewed, scholarly, and scientific articles in psychology. So if you just only want to look at the full text resources, then you should use PsycArticles. Then there's ERIC, the ERIC database. That stands for Educational Resource Information Center, which provides you with access to education literature and resources. There's information from journals included in current index of journals in education and resources and education index. There's tons of educational research stuff in there. So if you are at all interested in that kind of stuff, then you should take a look at ERIC. But if you're more of a medical kind of a person, you're more interested in that kind of stuff, then you should look at Medline and PubMed. Medline contains journal citations and abstracts for biomedical literature published all around the world. It provides the authoritative medical information on medicine, nursing, dentistry, veterinary medicine, healthcare system, and preclinical sciences. It features full text from more than 1,470 journals indexed in Medline. PubMed, on the other hand, this provides free access to Medline and links to full text articles. So when it comes to using these online databases, a lot of students have never really had much experience with that, and they don't really know exactly how to get access to it. There are a lot of instructional videos you can find online, like instructional videos for PsycInfo have been provided by the APA. And it can vary from institution to institution, so I can't really give you a concrete way of finding it because it might be different by the time you're watching this video. But the best thing you could do is just talk to your teacher, talk to the librarian on your campus, and try to get more information about using these databases. But what I can talk to you about is what I tend to use the most often, which are various internet search engines for scientific journal articles. The two that I've gotten the most use out of are Google Scholar and EBSCO. So they have their pros and their cons. Like I prefer Google Scholar the most because it's very easy to use. Like if you could do a Google search, you can use Google Scholar. It's that easy. It's also very easy to access. You don't need to sign in. You don't need to do anything besides just open up scholar.google.com. It's that simple. And another great thing about Google Scholar is it often does provide you with full text access, and there are various features that it also includes that will help you with your APA style. So if you're not really too familiar with how to cite your sources and create a reference page using APA style, Google Scholar will help you with that. But one of the big cons to using Google Scholar is that while some sources are full text, many of them likely will not be. A lot of research articles you'll find on Google Scholar are locked behind paywalls. And I just want to give you some advice. Never pay for this stuff. You should not be paying for this stuff. The people who should pay for this stuff are your institution. So whatever school you're going to, they should be paying for your access. And then besides Google Scholar, there's EBSCO, which you can find on most campuses. The big pro is that it generally gives you more full text access because your college has paid for it. And they often have more advanced like search options. But there's a bunch of cons that come with it. Like it generally is a bit more cumbersome. You know, it's harder to access. It's harder to log in. Like you typically need to use your username and password for your campus. And it's just not as user friendly in a lot of regards. Of course, if you take the time, you can get to be very efficient with it, but it's just, like I said, it's a little bit more cumbersome. But both of these are great ways to find research articles, and I recommend using both. You know, like if you use Google Scholar and you find some article that you think is great, but you don't have access to it, maybe you could find it on EBSCO. So to help you use both of these resources, I've actually created tutorial videos which I will put links to in the description for this video. So if you want to learn more about exactly how to use Google Scholar or EBSCO, just check out the description. Now, it's likely when you do this kind of research review, when you're finding all these sources, it's likely that you're going to be finding tons of stuff and you're not entirely sure if it's good or not. You need to do some screening. Most articles you find are going to be irrelevant. So here's some ways to weed out that irrelevant material. The first thing to look at when you find something is the title, obviously. Does the title catch your interest? Is it something that sounds close to what you're interested in? And if the title does sound interesting, step 2 is to look at the abstract. So just read the abstract. It's only a paragraph long. It won't take that long. Just read through the abstract. And if it still has maintained your interest, if you still want to learn more, the third step is to try to find a full text link. So if you have access to it, like in Google Scholar, you might be able to download a PDF of that article. That's what you should try to do next. And then once you download an article and you start reading through the introduction and looking at the discussion, maybe the method and results too, if it still has kept your interest, if this is still something that you really like, then you should read the full thing. Just take the time, get a good grasp as to what exactly these researchers did, and then now that you've found one good article, you can then use like the snowball method, where you take what that article has cited and you find those sources yourself. In other words, you are using the same sources that your article that you found has used. I don't know if I said that very clearly. All I'm trying to say is borrow their references, look at their references list, and try to find those same articles for yourself. Because obviously, if you found one paper that is really, really good and is really close to what you want, then maybe you will find more of what you want by looking at what they referenced. And when it comes to calling it a day, when it comes to finishing your literature search, I have bad news. You're never really going to be done. A literature review is kind of like a work of art. You know, it just gets to the point where you don't want to do it anymore. You're just sick and tired of doing this kind of stuff. I mean, sure, you can get to a point where you feel comfortable that you understand the previous research that's been done, but there's so much stuff out there, it's literally impossible to read all of it. Nobody can possibly read all of the research. So you just kind of keep working at it and keep learning and keep building that background knowledge until you just can't do it anymore. You can't add to it anymore. So I can't really tell you exactly how many research articles is enough for a good literature review. It's subjective. It varies from study to study. You know, maybe 5 sources is great for one particular paper, but 30 would be appropriate for another. It's impossible to say. So the most important thing when it comes to editing your literature search is just, do you think like you've provided a good background? Do you think that the person who reads your paper will understand what's come before, so that they can understand why you're doing this new study?